Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opening. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to see a room so packed for this important event. My name is Frédéric Destrobecq. I'm the Executive Director of the European Brain Council. It will be my pleasure today to moderate the discussion. And the objective of our meeting will be to exchange views, start a discussion on a very important topic for the healthcare community, and present the work and viewpoints from many organizations in order to kick off the Q&A and discussion afterwards, to which you are all very invited to contribute. So as the European Brain Council, we are quite pleased to facilitate the event, and we are grateful to MEP Pedicini to have hosted the event today, and also grateful to his team, Valentina, and also with the support of Andrea, Adriana, and Esther for putting this all up together. So the European Brain Council, just a few words to introduce those of you who are not familiar with the organization. We are a multi-stakeholder platform gathering patients, clinicians, and other actors active in what we call the brain space. And our work is really to try and build consensus through partnership and dialogue on various issues having a stake in neurology and mental health. So our aim today is to offer that stage, offer the opportunity for that dialogue and exchange of views, and have a discussion on off-label use, which really is an important issue, and you will hear more from Professor Goodwin in a moment on what it means for the psychiatric community in particular. So it's now my pleasure to give the floor to Signore Pedicini, who is coordinator for the EFDD of the ENVI committee, the Committee for Health and Environment. And in particular, it's our pleasure because Mr. Pedicini was very active on many health issues, and in particular, the own initiative report on safer healthcare in Europe, improving patient safety and fighting AMR. Mr. Pedicini, you have the floor.
Thanks, Frederick. Good morning, everyone. Because of most of these people, most of the visitors are from Italy, I will speak in Italian. Anche perché credo che l'italiano è...
Also because I think we need to defend Italian here in the European Parliament. We're working very hard to do that. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'd like to thank all of those of you who are here today. I want to thank the visitors from Italy. I know there are a lot of you, young people who are working or studying medicine at university, so they have a direct interest in the issue. We're going to be holding various events of this kind, and we're very pleased to be able to host them here. Let me also recall that we're being web streamed live, so there'll be lots of people following us over the internet, and that increases the size of our audience. When there are events such as this, I tend to begin with my personal experience. I'm a doctor. Well, now I'm a member of the European Parliament, of course, but until relatively recently, I was working in oncology, and I particularly focused on clinical research. And that enabled me to experience a series of events that helped me in the role I play now. And these are experiences that indirectly relate to off-label use, not only of medicines, but in my case, of radiation, and more specifically with regard to the combination of radiation and medicines. In the field of research, sometimes you have to push things forward a bit. And often that's a need that you can't reconcile with all the delays you need to ask questions of an ethical committee or find a solution that requires all the protocols to be followed. There are sometimes clinical requirements that mean that you have to experiment and try and find an innovative solution. But that brings you into an area where you have to be prudent, of course, but it's also an area that isn't generally known about. So there is off-label use of medicines, of pharmaceutical products, but also of radiation, basically anything that's used for health care. So I have had some experiences with regard to off-label use, and then I came to the European Parliament, as Frederick was saying. I have been involved with issues that are wider in nature, such as the own initiative report that pushed or aimed to push the Commission to draw up a text that could help us in the area of adverse effects. Adverse effects in healthcare and also the issue that is a massive threat worldwide, i.e. The increase of antibiotics resistance levels. Now in this context, we have pointed out several times that the off-label use of medicines, particularly antibiotics, could be a threat. Also indirectly, because very often the main cause of increased resistance is that antibiotics for humans are fed to animals, and then we eat the meat of the animals, and they get into our system. So that is also a form of off-label use of medicines. We've also dealt with specific cases, and there are people here who have helped us. For example, when it came to the use of Avastin, which was used to replace Lucentis, which is more expensive than an on-label medicine, and that saw various aspects emerge, i.e. The fact that sometimes off-label use is an opportunity rather than a problem. Also the issue of paroxetine, because we saw that most off-label use takes place when medicines are administered to minors, where it's much more difficult to carry out experiments on human beings. And here the threats and opportunities, of course, are amplified. So you can see this is a complex, wide-ranging issue that needs regulation. We've got experts here today from various sectors who are going to make their contribution to increasing our knowledge as members of the European Parliament, but also the Commission, which is also represented. And we want to urge the Commission to come up with a document that lists these medicines that are used off-label, but also that could help us to draw up appropriate regulation for this sector, which really needs it. Our main objective is to safeguard the health of patients, of course. You'll also understand, also from what you hear today, that there are legal aspects, commercial aspects as well, as always. But for us, the priority is the health of patients. I'd invited David Borelli, who is the co-founder of an intergroup that deals with patients' rights. I'm a member of that group. Unfortunately, he isn't feeling great this morning, alas, ironically, so he couldn't come. But he does welcome you all. And I hope that today's event, which is only going to last 2 hours, it's not particularly long, we'll be able to provide you with the information, we'll be able to provide us with the information that we need in order to be able to regulate in this sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pedicini. So, as mentioned, we will now be hearing contribution from the panel. I've asked everyone to stick to time, 10 minutes. And our first speaker of the day is Mark Dooms, who is hospital pharmacist at the University Hospital in Leuven and author of the Good Off-Label Use Practice Declaration, which is a document that you can find at the entrance of the room. Feel free to pick up a copy. And Mark, you have the floor to introduce us to the criteria and principle of the declaration.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity as a pharmacist to speak about off-label use. I'm a pharmacist and I work at university hospitals in Leuven. And my niche is the diagnosis and treatment of patients with rare disorders. As you all know, there are thousands of rare diseases and there are very few treatments. So during my career, 40 years at university hospitals, I walked a lot in the gray zone of off-label use because there was no treatment for patients with rare diseases. So during those 40 years, I said to myself, why not try to find a kind of guidelines that all the stakeholders, the prescribers, the pharmacists, the patients, the companies, would feel more at ease when we use their medication, their products off-label. So at the end, I will propose 6 very simple rules for better, good off-label use. Next slide, please. To know what off-label is, we need to know what a label is. The label of a medication is what you all call a package insert. So if you go to a pharmacy, you have a pharmaceutical product. With the product comes a label, a piece of paper that we call the product label. Legally, it is called the summary of the product characteristics. That is a legal document that tells you how you can safely use, at what dose, when you need to take it. Everything on that paper is proven by randomized clinical trials. So everybody feels safe when it is used on label. So the objective is bring a product on the market and tell how you can use it safely. Next slide, please. So off-label use is the use of the product as it is not mentioned on that label. So for now, I would propose that we are not going to talk about unlicensed use, which is something else, or falsified medication, or wrong diagnosis, or compounding, or whatever. Just off-label. The physician prescribes, me, a pharmacist, dispense the medication to a patient, and it is used and it is not mentioned on the label. For example, we can use for another indication. When there is no treatment, we can just use a medication for an indication that is not on the label. But we know by experience that it can work. I must tell that during my career, I've used off-label many medications that are now on the market as orphan drugs. So the off-label treatment became on-label. We also can use a medication in another dose. For some medications, there has never been any dose-finding study. So maybe we can use the medication at a lower or at a higher dose. A dose that is not mentioned on the label, on the package insert. Or we can use it for another patient group. The very best example is the treatment of cancer in children. On all medication that we dispense to treat patients with cancer, children, on the label is do not use in children. This is because the medication is developed for adults. And when it worked in adults, we started to use it in children. So the label states do not use in children. So we do not wait until the patient becomes 18 to start treatment. We start treatment earlier. We start treatment earlier before 18. So it is off-label. We use it in children. Or we can use it for another route of administration. For example, the very best example is cystic fibrosis. We use colimycin, an antibiotic for infections in patients with cystic fibrosis, but we use it as an aerosol because the infection is in the bronchi, not in the blood. So on the label states the antibiotic has to be used intravenously. We don't do that. We do that off-label as an aerosol. So we need to balance between the benefits and the risks. As a benefit, I would say rare disease is a very good example. We treat patients off-label with rare disorders, or pediatric cancer, or palliative care. But of course, at the other end, you have all the risks. For example, the patient is not informed. The patient does not know that we treat them off-label. Or there is a lack of information. As you all know, the literature is very unbalanced. We like very much to report good results. We do not like too much to report negative results. Though the literature is full of good things. We treat it off-label and it worked perfectly, but we hardly report when it does not work. So I started to work on a kind of good off-label use practice. So I went to a lot of discussions with physicians, with colleagues, pharmacists, with patients, trying to develop a kind of good off-label use practice in order that we all feel much better. So, my 6 points for good off-label use are the following. For me, no, the first, the other. So, for me, next slide. So, we need to have a severe, life-impairing or life-threatening condition. Of course, I know there is a gray area between that. There is not a strict line when a condition becomes severe. There is not a strict line when a condition becomes life-impairing or life-threatening. But of course, I think you all understand the more severe, the more life-impairing, the more life-threatening, there is more benefit for a medication to be used off-label. Second point, absence of authorized treatment or repeated treatment failure. Most probably you all know that today we have in hospitals sometimes drug shortages. So when there is a shortage of a drug, I cannot stop the treatment. So what I need to do is try to find another treatment. Sometimes it exists, but not all the time. When there is no treatment on the label, I think I need to go to off-label. So I start to use another medication off-label, waiting for the drug to come again on the market. Third point, absence of alternative treatments authorized for the condition. Another difficult point is pregnancy. You all know that children with rare disorders never became adults years ago. So the medication who came on the market has never been tested for safety on pregnancy. So all these children now, thanks to the very good treatment, become sexually active. They also want a family, and they have all the right to have a family. But we do not know if the medication can be used safely during pregnancy. So we continue off-label. Fourth point, the off-label use is supported by strong evidence in scientific literature. A few years ago, with a group of students in pharmacy, we went through all the official European guidelines for the treatment of rare disorders, and many medications were off-label. We all found, all the experts thought, it's a good idea to use it, but it was not on the label. Fifth point, the patient has to be educated and has been given his or her informed consent. I leave in the middle here if the consent needs to be written or if orally. So I do not know what I really need to propose. Do we really need a written informed consent? But maybe I can leave this for the discussion. And my last point is the presence of established reporting routes for adverse events linked to off-label use. We have now a European system called EUDRA Vigilance, where patients can report, even if it is off-label. And if I'm not mistaken, also companies need to note when they come aware of side effects that happened after off-label use. So, dear friends, these are my 6 very simple points, not to tell you what the truth is, but just to help to move into better off-label use for patients, for example, with rare disorders or children with cancer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would simply propose that if there are points of clarification, we can take them immediately. Otherwise, questions on content will be taken afterwards. So really for clarification of immediate point. Yes?
Yeah, my name is Maria Auken. I'm a member of the Parliament here and working also with the Just one question to the last point. Should it be mandatory?
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Sorry, your mic.
That's what I did, yes. Sorry. Should it be mandatory to have this reporting of the negative effects? And should it be mandatory that this should be disclosed so that everybody can go and look for it, so that we have some sense of, is this just a trick? Do we have, what is the cost efficiency? And all these things we have been up against for decades now and been robbed in so many public budgets from industry.
Okay. Thank you. Mark, you'd like to respond quickly?
Okay, that's a possibility, but maybe we can discuss that afterwards. Is it possible? Should you ask that to the company?
Yes, of course. Yes.
All side effects, on-label and off-label? Okay.
Okay, I will suggest that we take that. I'll suggest that we take that question for the broader discussion afterwards, because it seems to be broader than a specific issue relating to the presentation. But many thanks for raising it. In any case.
Just to add, we have a new law here in the Parliament, in the EU, a regulation which called for full openness. Full access in a searchable form for all results of clinical trials, which of course should include also that, I know it's clinical trials, but if you don't have the clinical trials and you use the medicine, it should be please the same.
Okay. But side effects are mandatory during clinical trials, that's for sure.
Okay, very good. I suggest we move on to the next speaker, who is Professor Guy Goodwin. Professor Goodwin is Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford and freshly immediate past President of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology. Professor Goodwin, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Fred. I'm speaking as a practicing psychiatrist, so I hope that some of what I say, although it will cover much of the same grounds as Mark Dooms has covered, is going to be complementary to what he said. Plus, my perspective is going to be largely towards the problems of prescribing in psychiatry. Could I have the first slide, please? So I'm going to look a little bit at definitions. I'm going to look at the issue of whether things are off-label but on guideline, which I think is probably where most of us would like to get to, and then reflect briefly on issues around safety and indeed for individual prescribing. So let's start with definitions, and you've already heard these. An on-label drug is a drug for which a prescription is for a condition which is officially approved, and that official approval comes either from, in practice, the FDA or in Europe, the EMA. And this means that companies are authorized to market a particular drug for a particular indication. That's what on-label means. And essentially, it's a description of what companies can do. Okay? Now, the drug must be shown to be safe and effective. That's the purpose of the research that the companies do on the drug before it's licensed. And of course, they have to, we tend to forget this, but the product has to be chemically pure and reliably so. And we tend to take that for granted, although if we lived in China or India, we might not be quite so confident. So those are issues that are essentially to do with companies. And if companies encourage off-label prescribing, this is against the law. And indeed, some companies have been convicted of doing that in some areas and have paid very heavily for having done so. So that's what on-label prescribing is, and that complements what Mark Doom said. So off-label prescribing, next slide please, is a prescription of a drug for a condition other than that for which it's been officially approved. Now, let's be clear that the FDA and the EMA do not dictate what doctors do, and so it's not automatically disallowed or a bad thing to prescribe off-label. And that means doctors are entitled to prescribe off-label if the drug is available, and the justification is then medical, not commercial. So the doctor essentially is taking responsibility for prescribing the drug. So if you're looking to regulate, then you're looking to regulate what doctors do. So you're going to have to look at how that's done in different areas and how it would best be done. And one of the issues here is that doctors, by and large, frequently now use medical guidelines which can be updated, which should be a statement of the most up-to-date practice, a summary of the most up-to-date evidence, which includes what is in the label, but also what is in the broader scientific literature. And those guidelines can legitimately encourage off-label prescribing, and that is not against the law. So let's be clear what off-label is, and what it means, and who is essentially it's aimed at and who is responsible. Next slide, please. So is this meaning of the label widely understood? I think probably not. I think many doctors believe that the approved indication limits their freedom of action. And certainly, if a doctor feels threatened by litigation, it is very likely that they will retreat into prescribing drugs which are defined exclusively by the label, which of course limits what the companies can tell him. Now, approval by the FDA or the EMA may also be confused by the decisions of national bodies not to endorse or reimburse the use of a drug. And that, for example, operates in the UK through NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. And that organization is quite influential worldwide. Now, if I can give you an example, sorry, could you go back one, please? If I could give you an example of how NICE has sometimes operated, it has suggested that particular drugs that were approved by the EMA, I can think of one example would be agomelatine, which is an antidepressant. It refused to essentially endorse that drug because they saw it as a second-line agent, and they claimed that it had not been studied as a second-line drug. Now, that's a particular interpretation of the data which had a strong effect on prescribing practice in the UK and effectively meant that that drug never became available for patients. So you can certainly have the intervention of bodies that are intermediate between the FDA and the EMA on one hand and official bodies like the General Medical Council in the UK that actually regulate what doctors do. So there are sort of third-party issues that can be very important in determining the access of patients, particularly to new medications. Next slide, please. So I deal not with rare diseases, but by and large with common diseases. And so when will off-label be common in those sorts of diseases? Well, certainly in groups like the children or the elderly who are excluded from registration studies. And the dilemma for child psychiatrists, for example, is that, by and large, there are very few studies that have been done specifically in children. There are two reasons for that. One is that simply they were difficult to do, and the second is they're even more difficult to do now. Because once one becomes and accepts particular treatments, it gets much harder to do placebo-controlled trials. So there are very few studies in children or the elderly, and that means that when, for example, one has a child with psychosis or a child with depression, then there is little choice but to extrapolate from evidence from similar conditions from the use of medications in adults. That can cause considerable problems because partly diagnosis issues and partly because the side effects of drugs may be different in different groups. The efficacy may be similar, but the side effects may be different. And in the case of the use of antipsychotics in children, this is particularly problematic because of weight gain and the metabolic syndrome. And we know that that has led to considerable problems in treating young people. And that is an issue that clearly is one that clinicians are extremely conscious of. We've heard a little bit about life-threatening or resistant conditions, and that's not usually the case in psychiatry, although there's certainly highly resistant conditions where treatment is very much off-label because of combinations of drugs. And combinations of drugs, in a sense, are a further issue, and they are a tricky one because they tend to when you multiply the number of drugs, you tend to multiply the risk of adverse effects. Third issue is when one medication from a class of drugs has approval and others in the same class may be considered. And the examples of that, for example, are if you have drugs like the SSRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are broadly licensed for both anxiety and depression. Some drugs only have a license in depression. Some have very wide licenses in anxiety and depression, but there's very little reason to think that the mechanism of action is different between the drugs, and so one can legitimately consider extrapolation from one drug to another. And rather similarly, something like where you think considering anxiety or depression and different drugs, one can often extrapolate between those as well. So that kind of thing will be relatively common and might be chosen either because first-line drugs produce side effects or on the basis simply of cost, because the economics of prescribing obviously enter often into treatment decisions. Next slide, please. So I think as a clinician, I know that I prescribe quite commonly off-label. I usually do so when it's endorsed by clinical practice guidelines. This is, for example, in the area of treating bipolar disorder, where there's been a relative dearth of research, and one is frequently having to extrapolate either from the scientific evidence rather than from commercial evidence, or from naturalistic studies looking at hard outcomes where there's good evidence for efficacy. The evidence may be good enough for clinical confidence, even though drugs are not licensed, and some commercial decisions by companies abort efforts to obtain a license rather prematurely. So, for example, aripiprazole has good evidence to support its efficacy in resistant depression. It does not have a license for that, but the evidence to use it in the context of resistant depression is pretty good. Next slide, please. I think one should also remember that we've talked as if that one has no problem if there is an evidence base from randomized clinical trials. It's worth remembering that they are average effects, not personal effects. The big challenge for medicine is to move to a more personalized approach to treatment. And at the moment, we treat average effects as the gold standard. Whenever we use treatments in an individual, we know that they have the potential for benefits and for harms, and we have a responsibility for tracking those within the patient. The weighing of that risk and benefit also lies with the patient, who can tell us whether it's what it's worth to them, but that's always, of course, imprecise. What I would say is that I think the challenge in the future is to collect data more systematically within healthcare systems, because although it's clearly important that drug companies collect side effect data, for example, in clinical trials, the numbers of patients that they study is relatively small compared with the number that get non-studied when practice when a drug becomes available for wide-scale practice. So there are millions of patients then exposed, and we should be working very hard on making better systems for collecting both side effects and outcomes out of that sort of in the healthcare system. Next slide, please. So these are just disclosures. I know about how the pharmaceutical industry works because of advising them on various development of various drugs, and this just summarizes some of the companies with whom I've had contact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Goodwin. Are there any questions very shortly of clarification only? Content for later. Okay, if there are none, I will... Yes? Very briefly, please.
Ringrazio l'onorevole.
I'd like to thank MEP Pedicini. I'm an Italian doctor. I just wanted to know whether the doctor can receive information from other Italian colleagues about off-label use of drugs. Does that exist?
Se esiste la possibilità tramite un collegamento.
Perhaps through the internet. Perhaps they can find out about the use that other Italian doctors are making of off-label drugs.
Okay. Yes.
Credo assolutamente.
I actually think not. Even in the world of medicine, there's very little awareness. Often doctors don't know how to use these drugs off-label. In fact, we need to regulate that aspect of things as well. I think that the internet is a great tool to disseminate information once we've drawn up rules, so that doctors are better aware of what's happening and the best course of practice. But at the moment, that awareness doesn't exist, and there's no information sharing among Italian doctors or anywhere else in Europe.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to the next contribution. Next speaker is Mr. François Houillet, who is Director for Treatment Information and Access at Eurordis. François, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good morning. Eurordis is the European Organization for Rare Diseases, and we estimate that our members represent 4,000 distinct rare diseases. If I can have the next one, and the next one. And I like to start with two examples which I think illustrate the case very well. This first patient who contacted us in January 2004 has a blood disease, Vaquet disease, a life-limiting disease with no clear treatment apart from phlebotomy. And she was a young woman treated already with interferon product, daily injection for a week every month. And she had requested a different form of the product, a pegylated form, which can be injected once, and then she has the side effects that go with it, only for 1 day instead for a week. If you can press again. The problem is that her initial request for the product was rejected due to the cost and the absence of evidence. So in this situation, we helped the discussions between the marketing authorization holder and authorities to see which additional studies would be needed for the national authorities to feel comfortable authorizing this off-label use and reimbursing this off-label use. And finally, a different company than the originator one obtained an orphan drug designation in 2011, and if you press again, and nowadays clinical trials are in progress with pegylated interferon for this disease, which says three things. First, we need data because you see, compared to hepatitis C, this disease is completely different, so the behavior of the product in these patients with Vaquet's disease are probably completely different than for hepatitis C. And the second observation is the time it takes between 2004 and 2016 to initiate the development of a new indication starting as an off-label use. And I think this is a lesson we need to reflect on. If you press the next one. The second example is a Belgian patient with multiple myeloma. who was treated because he had developed amyloidosis that could destroy his kidney. And he was treated with anakinra, which is an interleukin-2 receptor antagonist authorized for rheumatoid arthritis. And again, the decision was not to reimburse, not to cover the use of anakinra for this patient who had started, but then who had to stop. And if you press again, so we realized that the product was already tested in clinical trials for different types of amyloidosis. So it's not like if it was just used off-label and not evaluated. So we contacted and we made the contact between the clinician and an Italian team conducting this research so that they could share their scientific rationale to use anakinra to treat that disease. And the doctor could present this data to the Belgian authorities in an appeal procedure. The patient could start treatment again 2 weeks after it was interrupted and could save his kidney function. So all these to say that in these cases where there is a rationale to use a product off-label, there are still difficulties in doing so, particularly due to the cost, the absence of evidence, and the difficulties for experts to agree and to convey the message to authorities whether or not the off-label use is more or less relevant. If you press the next. So then we continued and we invite the reflection on off-label use. We invited Professor Dooms in a conference on rare diseases in Berlin, where we started the discussion of good and bad practices in off-label use. And the many questions we had already at that time was first to document on the frequency of off-label use. How frequent is it? There are data in children, and you see that almost 75% of medicines in children are used off-label. But in the rest of the population, we don't have a lot of information. How safe is it? Are adverse drug reactions reported? And if safety issues take over the benefit part of off-label use, are we going to restrict freedom of prescription? That's a risk we are aware of. What about the information to patients using a medicine off-label? Can healthcare systems reimburse an unauthorized use, an off-label use, and under which conditions? And when an off-label use is largely prescribed, shouldn't it be transformed in an authorized use, encouraging the marketing authorization holder to conduct clinical trials and to submit a marketing authorization application? Next slide. And we also have the problem of the economic model for off-label use in many cases. Suppose you have a product Z authorized for a disease, and clinicians propose to use it for a rare disease, a disease B. Then the company will have to conduct new clinical trials for disease B. And at the end, if it's effective and if it's safe, submit a marketing authorization and then propose a price and negotiate the price and reimbursement with authorities. And due to the cost of this additional research, of these clinical trials, in most cases, the product which is authorized to be used and no longer an off-label use comes at a higher price than the originator product. So for the company, there is an additional difficulty. What is the economic model which could give them guarantees that if they have additional expenses, they could have a return on investments? It's a real question. It's an open question that we think we need to find solutions for. Next slide. And another difficulty, you are well aware of the financial crisis that hit the world in 2008, and in Europe, member states adopted a series of measures to contain the healthcare expenditures and the pharmaceutical expenditures, one of which, and the intention here was to favor the use of generic medicines more than genuine medicines, is the mandatory substitution of the medicine, or the prescribers have to prescribe medicines using the active substance name, or the pharmacist has an obligation to substitute using the less expensive of all the active substances. And these measures were adopted in 11 member states. And if you click else. So here again, the issue is that for off-label use and rare diseases, if you make the effort of obtaining a marketing authorization in transforming an off-label use in a marketing in unauthorized use, and then your product is more expensive than the other ones on the market, and if in addition you have no chances of gaining any return on investments because systematically a pharmacist will substitute for the less expensive of the two, then we think this is against the general interest because it prevents, in a way, it may prevent industry to invest and to transform off-label users in unauthorized use. The next slide, please. So in order to learn more from our patients and what they think, we just conducted a large survey within our membership, and we collected almost 2,000 responses, of which I will present you the result of 1,350. We asked the patients to have their package leaflet with them when responding to the survey. And if you go to the next, so that's the demographics. In fact, here you see that we have some countries with quite a high number of data, and then we can do country comparisons. And what it came out from this study is that we could detect an off-label use in about 40% of the respondents. We asked them to read the leaflet and to tell us if what they read on the indication is related to their own disease, or the dose they read in the package leaflet is the dose they're taking the medicine, or if the route of administration is the way they use it. And when they said no, then we concluded that we had detected an off-label use. So for 543 for whom we detected an off-label use, and 496 for whom we could not detect an off-label use. That's roughly 40% of our sample of 1,350 respondents, which is a minimum probably, but 40% of patients with rare diseases from this survey are using a medicine off-label. The next. And then we had questions on which sources of information they trust the most. The only difference between those using a medicine off-label and those not using a medicine off-label was the trust for internet, with a statistical difference where people using a medicine off-label are trusting internet more than others, which we could discuss. Even if it's not their first source of information, their first source of information remains the hospital, the doctors, the nurses, and the pharmacist in both groups, and then other patient groups. The next slide. And that's not a surprise. Patients using a medicine off-label responded that the information on the benefits is clearly not enough, and the difference was highly statistically significant, with a large unsatisfaction with the quantity and the type of information they receive on benefits. The next. The same disconnect between what the doctor said and what is on the package leaflet. No surprise, it's logic, but there is, and it goes again with the information benefit, a lack of information. Patients who are using a medicine off-label don't have the written information to which to refer to, or at least not validated information they can trust and rely on. The next. Safety information. Here again, as for benefits, there is a larger group of patients in off-label group who say that they are not comfortable with information and on possible side effect. That's the red part of it. What is very reassuring is that when we ask them if they had side effect, there is no difference. There were no differences between both groups. Patients on off-label use or not on off-label have more or less the same patterns of side effects from mild to severe. It's not shown here, but when patients have a side effect, in 84% of cases, they reported the side effect to their healthcare professionals or using the web forms or the mobile apps that nowadays exist for patients to report directly. The next. And that's the end. So in addition to the good off-label use practices, what we think is needed in the absence of standard of diagnosis and care, in the absence of guidelines, and sometimes the guidelines are not always complete about it. We need more information on the benefit risk for off-label users, in particular when they are largely prescribed. And what we would propose is to have a kind of a referee, a scientific advice, for example, at the EMA, the European Medicines Agencies, where scientific experts from the Committee of Orphan Medicinal Products or the Human Medicinal Product Committee could come together, discuss off-label use, what information is already available, and what information is lacking and should be generated in order for the healthcare systems to use and to authorize or to reimburse these off-label uses more easily. And I thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, François. I would like to suggest we move on immediately to the next speaker, Mike Isles, who is Executive Director of the European Alliance for Access to Safe Medicines. Mark,
thank you, Frederick. Good morning, everybody. A special thanks to Mr. Pedicini for kindly hosting this important and timely meeting. I would like to start, and Frederick, I can assure you I will be within the 10 minutes. I'd like to start with a little bit of personal information, but I don't want to lighten the tone at all of this very important, serious subject. 35 years ago, whilst playing field hockey, I lost my front tooth. And at last night, at approximately 10 minutes past 10, I lost it again down the plug hole in my hotel. I managed to get it back and phoned a friend, and within about half an hour, we had identified a cabinet dentaire, the Grégoire Sénez, on the Avenue de Lézère, and by 11 o'clock my tooth was back in place, so I would like to highly commend the Belgian Brussels Dental Health Service. I was treated by a young woman who had come from Azerbaijan, who was highly capable and I would say very talented at what she does. It cost me 86 euros, and I have yet to pay, but I promise I will. Okay, so the European Alliance, just tell you a little bit about the organization I work for. The European Alliance for Access to Safe Medicines, or the EASM for short, has been involved, as you can see, in patient safety issues for some time. It was originally established as an independent pan-European not-for-profit community interest organization. It's dedicated to protect patient safety by ensuring access to safe and legitimate medicines, and it's formed by a cross-section of European patient safety stakeholders from a variety of backgrounds. Its activities include the exclusion of falsified and substandard medicines from the supply chain, and we had something quite a lot to do with bringing about the Falsified Medicines Directive. We also raised public awareness around the issues associated with falsified medicines, and it was interesting just to hear François about the trust that's put in the internet, and as we know, that's a growing illegitimate source of medicines, and people need to be informed about that. We also campaign for the safer use of unlicensed or off-label medicines, and it's this area I will specifically address now. Next slide, please. Thank you. That's the slide. It's important, as already mentioned, to remind ourselves of the current context that we find ourselves in. The banking crisis in 2008 has for sure had wide-ranging repercussions on global economics. And close to home, the member states have in general addressed the issue by more or less the imposition of austerity measures, sometimes overt, sometimes covert. And this is true in the setting of national health budgets and adoption of national measures limiting access to healthcare, medicines, etc., to save resources at the expense of patient safety. And we should also bear in mind that incidents and adverse events caused by these measures do in fact result in additional cost and burden to the healthcare system. Next slide, please. So it was against this backcloth we felt it was important to get a handle on the patient safety issues, and our investigations led to the publication of this report, which is on our website, When is a Medicine Not a Medicine? which revealed some disturbing facts. For instance, we discovered regulatory loopholes. Prescribing in the area of age-related blindness was leading to patient safety issues. And important safety, ethical and legal concerns arise when devices originally designed and labelled for single use are, despite the manufacturer's express instructions, refurbished, repackaged and reused. It's not surprising that the foreword by Jim Thompson says they make shocking reading. Following these findings, in 2011, a consensus paper was formulated by the ESM, the chief components being off-label medicines may only be used when there is no licensed product available that meets the medical need, establish the number of AEs, introduce a professional code of practice for mandatory reporting, and we've heard from the MEP at the front how important this perhaps could be, improve public awareness and the importance of AE reporting, and that patients give their consent. Personal preference is it should be written because it's more likely to happen than if it's just orally given. Okay. The ESM was pleased to be able to add suggestions for the European Parliament Patient Safety Own Initiative report, which was passed in plenary on May the 19th, and we welcomed the acknowledgement that off-label use constitutes a risk, should therefore be carefully regulated, and called on the European Medicines Agency to develop guidelines on off-label unlicensed use of medicines. It's perhaps useful to note that in the first Parliament Own Initiative report in 2013, this also called for guidelines. The ESM added to the debate by a Parliament event entitled Managing Healthcare Costs, Can Patient Safety be Traded Off?, hosted by MEPs Faria and Buissoy. It highlighted the staggering statistic that you see here, and that has still to be addressed properly. This leads to the area of my talk which looks specifically as to the harm being done to patients. The ESM wrote to Commissioner Andriukaitis in December of last year, calling upon the Commissioner of Health to investigate a potential situation that was causing harm to patients. The potential public health problem was exposed on the 13th of October 2015 by the Italian press, which revealed that 5 people had suffered serious eye infections following the use of a medicine off-label during a procedure in an ophthalmology department of the Hospital of Correggi, Florence. Alarmingly, it appears that the off-label use was for economic reasons. This incident in Italy constitutes evidence that using a drug for an indication for which it has not received regulatory approval presents a significant risk for the patient safety, and of course there are other examples which I've listed here. It's important to note that in a recent Canadian study published in JAMA of Internal Medicine, November 2015, prescribing drugs off-label is associated with around a 50% increase in risk of adverse events. Now, there are many examples of adverse events due to off-label use, which have made it to the newspaper headlines in the US and Europe and other countries. These events that harm patients clearly highlight that sidelining approval procedures or any moves to relax existing rules at the expense of patient safety is unacceptable. And likewise, it is important that the industry never promotes indications that are off-label, and one hopes that the massive fines hitherto imposed on pharmaceutical companies will put off any future activity in this area. And of course, this principle should hold not only for companies, but for governments as well. It was encouraging and gratifying to receive such a comprehensive letter back from the Commissioner, acknowledging, amongst many things, that it is a complex issue, yes, we know that, and that the Commission had requested a study to understand the ramifications of off-label usage. In addition, he wrote, The study will deliver a clear description of existing and foreseen practices of off-label usage, and, this is important, possible envisaged tools, which is essentially what we're talking about today, to regulate the off-label use of medicines. However, given that the study was originally commissioned in 2014, I am sure that we would all agree we should see and then act on the results of the report in a more speedy fashion. The ESM was invited to a brainstorming session as part of the Commission study, organised by the Neville Group. This gave the opportunity for a wide-ranging views to be taken into consideration. I believe the group, though, was disappointed in the fact that no one from the medical profession was in attendance, and begs the question, why is there not more interest from this group, as OLU directly affects patients and their treatment outcomes, which is primarily under the control of a doctor. It is also useful to note that a number of the groups suggested that guidelines were needed and that a body such as the EMA should spearhead their introduction. And I conclude by reiterating that the ESM fully endorses the GOLUP guidelines, and I would urge the Commission and interested stakeholders to do the same, surely with probably some suggestions and amendments to make it even better. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mike, for this very convincing.
Did I keep to time?
Yes,
Thank
more or
you.
less.
More or less.
Thank you very much. Now that we have addressed the two presentations relating more to patient safety and patient feedback, are there any point of clarification before we move on to the next two speakers addressing the regulatory framework? I see no fingers raised, so, okay, very briefly, please.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Giuseppe Pastore. I am a physician coming from Italy. I want to thank Mr. Pedicini for organizing this event. In Italy, there is a problem of defensive medicine from a few years of so-called defensive medicine. So doctors often don't prescribe off-label drugs in order to avoid legal consequences. So this represents a problem actually in the correct off-label use of drugs and brings up to the attention the problem of controlling drugs companies that, as private companies, have the purpose of profit, while the purpose of a public sanitary system, as we have in Italy, is, or maybe should it be, the healthcare of citizens. This difference of purposes should be solved by policy. But is policy truly interested to solve this problem? This is my question.
Would you like to address it to someone in particular?
Mr. Pedicini or the last speaker?
Ma guarda, io capisco la tua...
I understand your question, and it's true, particularly in Italy, there is a problem there, but I don't want to focus this discussion on issues relating specifically to Italy. I mean, yes, defensive medicine is a problem in Italy, but it's not only a problem in Italy. There are, across the world, procedures that are being developed with regard to prescriptions and also in the way that prescriptions are carried out. And actually, research can't keep up with requirements. So, as you can see, now we've established a context in which doctors are often the victims of accusations, often unfounded, and this is also contributed to by the internet. So we are seeing this trend today, pursuant to which doctors find they have to defend themselves a little bit and defend what they do, and that's something that's particularly an issue when it comes to off-label use. But it is a very good question. I'd like to thank you for asking it, and I hope that the other speakers, other people here, the Commission as well, will be able to receive the message. We're trying to put the pieces of this puzzle together so that we can better regulate this sector. Thank you.
Scusate se mi permetto.
If I may, could I just come in again? I mean, the weight of the responsibility
Off-level drugs in the actual situation. E questo è un problema.
And that's a problem, a serious problem, a major problem. The last speaker mentioned the fact that there were no doctors in the Commission. I mean, I think that's a major problem. It's something that needs to be dealt with. Just very briefly, because we're going to run out of time. It's not true that there are no doctors in the Commission. The various DGs, Directorate Generals, have various expert groups that work to support and advise decision makers. There are doctors involved. The problem is that we need regulations that don't exist. And prior to regulating, you need to be aware of all the problems. You need an overview of all the issues that you need to deal with, and everything needs to be looked into and assessed. You have to take account of all the various stakeholders, the various interests at play, of course. But our main focus is, of course, patients' interests, but there are other interests there as well, of course. Thank you.
So now we move on to our next speaker, who is James Killick, or his partner at White & Case. James, you have the floor, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a lawyer. So I'm going to be giving you an overview of the legal rules that currently apply in this space. And I'm going to cover 4 basic points. Firstly, the broad general rule that any medicine must have an authorization before it can be placed on the market. Second, look at the limited exceptions to that rule. Thirdly, look at the case law on the role of doctors in prescribing unauthorized or off-label medicines. And finally, look at the role that economic considerations can play as a matter of the European Court's case law, and then try and draw it up in 9 minutes with some conclusions. So, as you see from the first slide, the law is really rather clear. A marketing authorization is compulsory for medicines. And we see that in Article 6.1, which is up there on the slide. Medicines can only be dispensed in Europe after they've obtained a marketing authorization from the relevant national body or from the EMA. And a medicine needs to obtain that authorization for each individual indication, for each individual disease. And the reason we have marketing authorizations, it's self-evident, but it's to protect the patients. To get a marketing authorization, you need to go through preclinical, then 3 stages of clinical trials. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of patients are monitored very carefully. I've read from the pharmaceutical industry that for every 5,000 potential molecules they think might do something, maybe 1 makes it to the market. So you can see there's a big kind of failure rate for things that don't pass muster, aren't good enough. So that's the reason we have the kind of the compulsory marketing authorization. It's for patient safety. Now, there are only relatively limited exceptions to this requirement of the marketing authorization. In fact, there's 5, which again are on that slide up there. And from an EU law perspective, given the reason for having a marketing authorization is the protection of human health, each one of these exceptions would be interpreted narrowly by the court, because when you've got you need an authorization to protect human health, any exception must be interpreted narrowly given that overriding principle you start with. And one thing, when you look at these narrow exceptions, the exceptions that are in the legislation, they're all basically based on health needs or the needs of the patient. So if we look at the 5 of them, first one, pharmacy-made preparations, that's basically when the pharmacist creates a slightly different version of formula of the drug. The second one, authorized clinical trials, the idea being we give drugs to patients to try and develop the drug. We give medicines to patients to try and develop the drugs for the future, again for human health. Third one, emergency situations. Now, example would be, for example, when we had the recent Ebola outbreak, there was some very early vaccine that had been trialed and hadn't been approved, but people thought it might work. There was no other treatment, so it was approved, that was in Africa, that this vaccine was given to Ebola victims. And we have the same principle that under the European law, if God forbid something like that happened in Europe, we would be able to get things that aren't approved on the market quickly via an emergency situation. The next one is compassionate use, and that's where the patients have no existing treatment and they can't enroll in a trial. So for various reasons, you can't get them in a trial. Compassionate use is the only way to give these patients some hope. And then the final one, which is probably the broadest and most important one, is what's called special needs. And effectively, that's where the products have been supplied in response to a bona fide unsolicited order, formulated in accordance with the specifications of the doctor for use by the individual patient under that doctor's direct responsibility. Or to put it very simply, the doctor decides this patient needs a cure, the doctor's looking at the benefits for this individual patient who needs a cure, and they're allowed to give them whatever treatment they think on their medical grounds is necessary to help the patient. If you go to the next slide, there's one important point. I know we're here discussing off-label use, but there's one important terminology from a legal perspective. In European law, we have authorized medicines and we have non-authorized medicines. You're authorized for the indication or you're not. So off-label, unlicensed, they're all not authorized. So from a European law perspective, off-label is not authorized from an EU law perspective. That said, if you're a doctor, you have one medicine that's never been authorized at all, it's not gone through clinical trials, that's in a different category for something that has been approved for something where it's gone through the various medical criteria to get approved for one indication or another. You've got a bit more confidence there that that people have tested it. People aren't going to the unknown side effects will have been tested during that process. So whereas from a legal perspective, authorized and non-authorized is the rule, off-label use you can see from the individual doctor's perspective. There is a difference when exercising clinical judgment. Can we have the next slide, please? So the next point I want to deal with is what the case law says about the role of the doctor in prescribing unauthorized or off-label medicines. And the case law of the European Court is very clear. Prescribing unauthorized medicines is a decision for the doctor based on their view, the clinical judgment of what is best for the patient. And we see there are three recent cases all basically saying the same thing. We see Commission Poland saying prescribing off-label is based on individual situations justified by medical considerations. We see Novartis Pharma, again, it's about the doctor's view for his patients. And the same in the CTRS judgment. Off-label is the responsibility of the physician. So the case law says very clearly, if you're giving something off-label, it should be based on medical grounds, based on the experience of the doctor, what they've considered, the situation of the patient. It's a medical decision. And the way this is the special needs exception we saw on the slide 2 before that lets the doctor decide, that gives them the freedom to prescribe off-label. Now, there are, in addition to this is European law, there are often quite detailed guidance, rules, ethical considerations at national level about what a doctor can and cannot do and when, in which circumstances, how you judge whether to prescribe off-label. But that is not an EU law thing, that's essentially all at national level at this point. And there is one other legal issue, obviously, if you're prescribing off-label, and I know that the doctors just said this, obviously doctors can be sued these days. They are sued. This kind of American trend of suing doctors is coming more and more around in Europe. And if you prescribe an off-label medicine, and the patient has an adverse reaction, you can be sued for that just like anything else. So there is the liability issue for the doctor. So if we go to the next, so that's the doctor's decision. The next slide, the final slide, the question is what role the financial considerations have under the case law. And again, the answer here is fairly clear. Financial considerations, cost saving, shouldn't play any role in this area. Financial considerations are not a valid reason to promote or push for off-label use. It really should be based on clinical judgment according to the case law. And I think there's a whole, at a very high level, there's a whole set of cases from the 1990s going back to the mad cow disease in Britain, where Britain challenged the export ban on British beef, saying this is costing me a lot of money. And the court said, no, Britain, doesn't work like that. You cannot plead economic reasons against public health. Public health comes first. And that's very well established in the court's case law. You see lots and lots of judgment. I've cited the Pfizer case up there. When we're taking public health against financial considerations, public health always wins in Europe. Second, in the cases about off-label use, and that's the one Commission v. Poland, the European Court expressly rejected the idea that we could base off-label use on financial considerations. We're going to take a medicine off-label to save money. And the courts rejected that. They say, no, no, no. Off-label use, off-label prescribing is the doctor. It's a clinical thing. It's the doctor. The special needs exception is a clinical exception. It's not a financial one. And obviously that applies to off-label as well as unauthorized, since from an EU law perspective, you're either authorized for the indication or you're not. And finally, the financial stability of a national healthcare system is not really a matter of EU law anyway. It's a question of national responsibility, national competence. It's, we don't have a EU-wide health budget. We don't have, EU-wide regulation of healthcare system. It's all done at national level. So EU law says to the member states, well, that's your competence, that's your responsibility. And we see the case law, the Dufar case there under free movement of goods. National budgetary rules have never been a reason to stop free movement of goods. So again, the idea that money should play a role here is rejected by the European Court. It should be what's best for patients. So from a legal perspective, I think maybe just 4 conclusions. Firstly, off-label use should be based on clinical considerations. It's the doctor who should be in charge here. They need to decide what's right based on medical reasons. Secondly, using financial considerations, promoting off-label use to save money, the courts have not accepted that. They've said that's illegal. Thirdly, to my mind, I don't see why you want to mix prescribing tendencies, off-label use with financial considerations. The National Health Services have various mechanisms to cut costs if they want to. They set the prices, they set the reimbursement level, they have health technology assessments, they have negotiations. Mixing the two, to me, seems as a matter of policy wrong, especially where you have ways to cut money if you want to. And finally, going back to this idea about defensive medicine that the doctor just raised, if a government were to promote off-label use for cost reasons, say to the doctors, you must do off-label because it's going to save me, the government, money, doesn't that leave the doctor in a nasty situation from his personal liability if something goes wrong, God forbid? That the doctor is being forced to prescribe off-label to save the government money, but the doctor could be responsible. And I think, going back to what Professor Dome said, there's also an issue about patient consent. If I'm the patient and I'm told you're getting this drug that's not authorized, that hasn't gone through 3 stages of clinical trials because it's going to save the government money, I don't know. I suspect some patients might have a few issues if it were phrased in a direct sense like that. So thank you very much. That's the kind of introduction to the legal side.
Many thanks, James. We now move on to our last contribution of the day, and I'm really glad to say that we have found a doctor in the European Commission. So Dr. Rees is Director for Medical Products and Innovation in DG Santé, and has a background as a radiologist. So Dr. Rees, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for introduction. I'm a radiologist and public health physician, and but it's always interesting to speak after lawyers. I have to control myself because I just will focus on in my 10 minutes on these three topics. The first one I think I will go quickly because James already introduced a number of issues, and then I will explain the studies and what are the next steps concerning the coming to a few weeks. So let's go for the first slide on the line. So what is out-of-label use already was explained. I'm not going to the detail, but I would like to just again, stress the when we authorize the products, we give we give indications. So when we use differently than indications, of course, we can see this as out of label. I think it also was explained the different dosage method of administration and different groups of adults and children. Maybe one word more about children and pediatrics. You know, this was exactly why we decided to, Parliament decided also develop the regulation in pediatrics, because we understood, you know, we have to do something to help with these populations to get access to medicines. It'll be very interesting as we are now assessing these regulations, know how this work in practice and is working or not working. You know, will be very, very interesting for all of us to have reflection in coming year, because we hope to publish quite detailed report about this legislation implementation. So then go to the next problem. You know, the concept of the basic rules, as we already was explained, the placing on the market. But then, of course, is the prescription of medicines, and again, as James said, it's very important to say that we are regulating products. We are not regulating the medical practices on the EU level, and this is the kind of very important distinction, because when we discuss about solutions, we also have we have to take account, you know, the responsible the roles for everyone in the system, national level, European level, but also professional practice and a number of other stakeholders involved, patients as well. And finally, we have this famous, you know, characteristic of products which we try to put in on the leaflets, which was also Francois remind us the study they have done with patients. This is main legal document patient has access to read. And then, you know, when this out of label use is coming, already was explained the exceptions and bona fide unsolicited order, when really patients is in need, and individually doctor is defining this as an individual decision. I mean, it's also interesting question, you know, how we treat, you know, how we see the group of patients versus the individual decision of doctor, because formally speaking, every decision should be individualized to the person. So when patient is coming to our office, we decide we are in the kind of safe zone in the concerning at least this type of decision. But then maybe I can also answer to the questions about where is the obligations of reporting coming, and new pharmacovigilance regulations, but the obligations on companies also to report about the side effects, also if they were out of label use. So this is of course, you know, not the problem, because we discussed a little bit, you know, it's not that we don't have law to report, but the why prescribers are not reporting is the other issue. And of course we have now new way of reporting. I think Francois also mentioned this, the self-reporting of patients. Mm-hmm. And I think it's maybe important also to kind of work with patients, and when they are aware that the medicines out of label prescribed, you know, the patients is encouraged to report back to the self-reporting system. But just one idea more. We have also possibility, it is also important, when we find evidence, because company has to report every clinical trials in the products already authorized, and so basically we have to know whatever knowledge is available about the authorized product should be reported to the medicine agencies, and then we have to know this. But also it can be decided the kind of additional warnings or contraindications use of outside of marketing authorization can be issues which already happens. Okay, then go to the studies. So why the study was triggered? You know, maybe I should also refer to the report prepared under command of our chair today. And this is also important call for us to go ahead with this study, because in the resolution of October 2013, a number of stakeholders calls already mentioned today, we decided that we have to go ahead with this study. What we like to understand better, the variety of national frameworks already discussed here. There's a lot of going on national level, and it's important to understand how this interaction between the European system and member states may work or is not working. Same, you know, what are the new initiatives we were not able to kind of see from our end. The prevalence of out-of-label use and different therapeutic areas. This was very tricky questions. the study should answer. Then the scope, next slide please. The scope of study was based on the first big questions, the patient safety, because in the report of the Parliament it was also very straightforward stressed, and legal framework we are operating in this field. And general objective was to really also to understand better the practice of available use, the number of case studies, which also are showing, you know, the complexity of this exercise and how the decision was born, you know, and how eventual reaction of different member states happened. We tried to get information about the factual analysis of all parties involved in this. I mean, it was referred to the stakeholders meeting. This was an opportunity for stakeholders to discuss, but this issue is, I mean, if you like to put all stakeholders on the map, doctors, pharmacies, companies, regulators, payers, HT bodies, you know, it's getting very complex. So I think there's also reflection in the studies you will have chance to see soon. Then we go for the next important objective of the study was to see how the information is comprehensive on the national frameworks, both legislative but also recommendation guidelines, because we discussed already this today, you know, how those recommendations are used in different countries. What are the drivers of this out-of-label use? For example, availability of medicinal products on the market, no authorized alternative of medicinal products, costs of medical products. So there are some examples, but we can look for other one. Then we wanted to understand better the existing measures put in place already because of patient safety concern. For example, informed consent, I think already was proposed as a one of solution. If you decide to go for out-of-label prescription, let's think about you, patient, explain, and eventually also for your own legal protection, get this kind of consent. Registers, some countries are establishing registers, really trying to see what is the outcome of this use of these medicines. Publication of different databases, and they recognize the out-of-label use. So this we wanted to understand better. And then what else? Next question was how to do this analysis of all parties involved in this exercise. So basically the stakeholders map and see the position and possible solution as well. And factual analysis of the interplay between the national and EU framework already explained, you know, including case law and how those, you know, current legislation is interacting. And let me say just a word about next step. So please, next slide. So the study was presented to the important group, which is now working, you know, under chairman of commission, but this is constructed by member states, experts. And we wanted to member states really to go through these studies and give additional comments, because it's important, again, I stress this, a lot of practices happen on national level and we really have to input from member states. We hope to finalize studies by contractor end of this year, and this will be, I think, good moment for all of us to reflect and continue this debate based also on the facts we're able to gather through these studies. And of course, the big questions, which is also was asked today, what is the potential role, you know, for EU level, member states coordination? What is the role of if member states consider that we need to develop some kind of new approach towards guidelines? But I think already was mentioned one presentation, you know, how much those guidelines are more framework and the scientific base. What is the limit of EMA involvement? Because EMA doesn't work outside the regulatory framework. They are part of the regulatory framework, very much focused on scientific assessment. There are already some interesting concern presented by colleagues before. So I think it's it would be very important decision. You know, what is the best in one hand to help with access to therapies, but at the same time, you know, increase the safety and awareness and understanding of this phenomena, because it's clearly it's an issue, and I would like again thank very much for the opportunity speaking today and having exchange of ideas.
Thank you very much, Andre. I'm now opening the debate with the floor. I have a few instructions for you. Please introduce yourself when you're given the floor, and be as concise as possible, and also say if your question is directed to any speaker in particular. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you again for giving me the floor and for this arrangement here. I'm Margrethe Auken. I'm a member of the European Parliament from the Greens and the Envy Committee that has dealing here on this here, and also been dealing with clinical trials regulation. I have two questions. First, I was happy to hear that, of course, reporting was mandatory for side effects. But in addition to this, transparency. If we have no transparency on this here, so everybody, and not only you doctors, only a little group of these doctors can follow what's going on, it's no help. So we need to make sure that transparency is basic. Secondly, and I think it's a question to several of the presentations here, when you report the risk of a doctor prescribing off-label medicine and how he can be sued and so on and so forth, and what's going on in the authorization. Conflict of interest. It wasn't mentioned at all, and for me it's basic that everybody who takes decisions on behalf of me should be without any conflict of interest. It's not enough to declare your conflict of interest, because then I have to investigate, is he a decent person, does he pay his taxes, is he faithful to his wife, and so on and so forth. None of my business. None of my business. I must be sure that nobody has bonds or privileges or salaries from pharmaceutical industry when they're doing this stuff here. Then I will feel much more safe if that is absolutely clear. And we are dealing with it with EMA, who is not convinced that I'm on the right side here. And it's the same with the FDA. They are not on the right side for sure. And, but the Ombudsman is absolutely, and also the EU regulation is not, the EU treaty is on my side, and that should be a key issue if you're dealing with these difficult things here. That's no conflict of interest at the table. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had one more, sorry. I was asked to make sure adaptive pathways, this fast track to medicine, which to me is a scandal. And just give me 5 minutes on television, I can get the public opinion on my side easily. That, because it's no deal to find a terminal patient crying for new medicine. All of us know that kind of stories, but we have no knowledge afterwards of side effects at all, whatever happens. So it's a disaster if that is going to be a new model and not a very, very specific exemption.
Okay, thank you very much. You're raising very interesting points, which I'm sure our contributors will be eager to react. I'll take one or two more questions and then answers from the panel. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you for the talk. I'm Matthias Neets. I'm a health economist and I work for the Belgium Healthcare Knowledge Center. That's an independent HTA agency providing advice to our policymakers. I think some points, I'll try to be concise, promised, but I think some points are interesting here for the discussion. First one is on what I think is a misunderstanding on the substitution for financial reasons only. If you look at the perspective of a government, then in fact sometimes products don't have a marketing authorization because of economic reasons from the point of view then of a company. But if you look from a government, if they do HTA, they look in the first place at the medical aspect, never at the economic one. We start with effectiveness, safety, effectiveness. And so there's a big difference to say it's for economic reasons only and to say no. First we looked at the safety and efficacy, and we have independent trials from NIH, from NIHR, from ERTC, from whatever independent government-supported trial, then that's very different. Then you base yourself on evidence. And in fact, we made a report on this issue, published last year in October. It's available for free on the internet at KCE. And it includes a step plan. And in that step plan, we don't exclude, for example, off-label use where there is an alternative. It is possible, and I think sometimes governments are made afraid that you say, oh, you can't because of these economic reasons only. You're doing something that is in contradiction with European legislation. Well, that's a big misunderstanding because it's not for economic reasons only. It's based first on evidence. And I think for another stakeholder here, not only government, but also physicians, practitioners who want to use off-label, governments can sponsor studies with off-label. If the results are very positive on safety and efficacy, they can include it in guidelines. And then, as mentioned in the presentation of Dr. Goodwin, there are good guidelines, then there's no problem with liability, even if there are sometimes safety issues. If you have 2% of safety issues in the one arm and 2 in the other, sooner or later you will have a patient with a problem. But it's not then that you have done something wrong. You just follow the evidence. You do what is usual practice, what other colleagues would also have done maybe in the same situation. And then, in fact, it would be more wrong not to use the cheaper evidence-based one, because then you're harming the system, because you could have used that money for a lot of other good things. And so, well, I'll stop here, but maybe it's interesting for people who are interested to look at that report, who looked at European legislation, case law, and to see what is possible already under current legislation. Not that we need new regulation, it's already possible at national level to have a good policy and to have a good, let's say, justified use of off-label products. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have enough on our plate for the time being. Mark, you'd like to react?
Yes, I have 3 answers to your questions. First, transparency. I think the best transparency, if you absolutely want transparency, is register. We do that for rare diseases. There are not too many patients, so it's very possible to have a register. My patient, this treatment, and this is the efficacy, this is the safety, etc. That is, I think, the closest we can come to total transparency. Second, conflict of interest. Nobody ever paid me to do whatever. So, yeah, I tell you. And then adaptive pathways. Well, it's a new system. And companies try to cut off off-label use, but for the best of my knowledge, it has not that success. So I think it's not the very best way to come down with less off-label use.
Okay, thank you. James or Andre, do you have contributions to make?
Sure. To respond, since I'm the lawyer here, I'll respond on the legal side of the economic, in terms of off-label use for economic reasons. You know, the court's case law is relatively clear. They've rejected the idea of economic saving money as a reason for unauthorized medicines, and that fits in with a case law going back 20, 30, 40 years, where every time there's any kind of a balancing between public health and money, they say we protect public health. Going back to the UK mad cow disease, where, you know, if you look at the number of people who actually got sick of this disease, it was relatively small. If you looked at the economic consequence, it was very big. But clearly, the European Court came down on the side of public health 100% and told the UK, no way, we're undoing that ban on British exports, because when we balance the two, it's a very we give public health the greater weight. And the second point I'd make, you said at one point, we don't do it just for economic reasons. No, there's also a clinical reason. I mean, I'd be more sympathetic to off-label use if there is based on purely clinical reasons. If you're saying it's partly for a clinical reason because there's evidence, but also it's because it's cheaper, you know, one or the other is clearly driving it. In my mind, it's always the cheaper one, because if there was to actually do the same phase 3 trials as the drug companies would cost an awful lot of money for our National Health Service. So you're effectively doing a shortcut on the safety side to save money for the system. Knowing how much a phase 3 trial costs and how much you would save as a member state, you inevitably, to save money, you're going to be cutting corners. And I think obviously off-label use for the doctors, if there is no treatment, they're doing it already.
I'd like to react on that Because in fact, that's the argument that is often used by specific stakeholders, and it is absolutely wrong. If it's evidence-based, if there are phase 3 trials by government sponsored, there is public funding in UK, in US, Netherlands, Belgium is also starting now, then that's the reason. It's not economic reasons only. We start from the evidence that it is safe and effective. And in those cases, in fact, you are harming the health system, the public health, if you're going for the most expensive alternative. Because, well, I saw on one slide reasonable prices. It's not always reasonable prices. Often it's very high budget impact. And then if you have an alternative that is safe and effective, and you can use those 10 millions, 20 millions, 300 million euros a year for other things, then in fact it's better for your health system, for your public health to do so. Because we want health systems of the best quality. Accessibility is also very important, and also the financial sustainability. And in those cases, you are supporting such a system. So you're doing the best for public health if you take into account economic considerations next to, not only, but next to the medical argument. And it starts from the medical. In fact, in some cases, it's the physicians on the floor that want to use an alternative. And they say it's off-label, we're afraid of using it. But in fact, we see that we can save a lot of money to pay other things for. And so that's the reasoning of accessibility, of acceptability, those terms. So I think we can have a very large discussion, but this is the hot issue of what to do with off-label if there is an alternative. And it is possible to support that in a good, justified way, from scientific point of view.
But it's money?
James, just a moment. Before other members of the panel have a chance to contribute to your very extensive contribution, I would like to call on just the respect of the viewpoints expressed, because saying that one stakeholder is wrong or another is right is probably not the best way to have the dialogue today. And I think it's also part of KC DNA to have that stakeholder engagement where everyone is able to express freely his point of view. So you have had your chance. Please let the panel respond.
No, I think maybe what is interesting, I think, in this debate about the guidelines, what is the value of guidelines? I think we maybe a little bit develop more this concept of guidelines that are developed by different societies, and it's a very interesting question how we go in the future for if any guidelines will be recommended, framework for guidelines, because guidelines anyhow they are not obligatory, so my understanding is the different associations may decide to issue those guidelines, and then every time physician is prescribing medicines is taking his own responsibility still. I mean, this is not the. Can we develop this a little bit more, because I think you referred it in your presentation. If I may use opportunity also to have an interaction between the panelists.
Sure. I mean, I think. Certainly in the UK, there's a very extensive system of guidelines organised by, as I said, by NICE, National Institute for Clinical Excellence. They in fact use economic modellings quite a lot, so that in fact their recommendations are influenced by economics. So a nod to you. Individual organisations also produce guidelines, and I think they can be in some ways more close to the ground and less close to the government. And they have tended to be preferred sometimes by clinicians. So I've been part of those guidelines. They usually involve 25 or so experts, various stakeholders, patients, organizations, and we try and hammer out a really detailed blueprint of what first-line treatments should look like, what second-line treatments might be, and we try and indicate where things are well understood and supported by the evidence. There's a pretty good traffic light system for saying whether you have very good clinical trial evidence, multiple trials all agreeing, or where you come back down to cohorts and individual experience. And I think there's a good ways now of ranking evidence for confidence. So I think that certainly in the space in which I practice, I feel well supported by guidelines, and I feel that when I prescribe off-label, as I quite frequently do, that I know that I'm doing it with professional support, and I'm not afraid of legal challenge. But I know equally that could occur because of the world we're in.
Many thanks. François, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, a few comments. I'll start with the guidelines. And of course, I only reflect in rare diseases, but we've been discussing the efforts needed to produce guidelines for each rare disease, and the absence of experts is often an obstacle. There are so many rare diseases with no guidelines, and even when there are guidelines, the problem is that they usually apply to the best ideal situation, but then when it comes back at the national level, because care varies from countries, then we need national guidelines, and it's a kind of circus where we have a few experts who would like to prescribe a medicine off-label, and then they are recommended to obtain a consensus among other experts, and it comes back to them, to the same who initially prescribed the medicine. So the issue of guidelines is a way forward, but in practice, usually difficult. About transparency, just a few words. There is still an underreporting of adverse drug reactions by more than 96%. And in 2002, when patient organizations working with the EMA asked to review all pilots for where patients can report adverse drug reaction themselves, it convinced so much the European legislator that now it's part of the legislation. And since it is in 2012, there was a 50% increase in the reporting of side effects by patients. And I think this is the way to work to encourage patients and healthcare professionals to report more rather than to make it mandatory, because the logistic of making it mandatory could be questionable. And now these side effects are even more easier to review. There is, from Eudravigilance, a public access to all side effects reported to European authorities, so certainly an increased transparency about those. And lastly, about if I can give my opinion on the informed consent. It's my personal view more than my organization's view, because we don't have a consensus, but it's clear that we see a trend of medicine becoming more and more an administrative discipline, and with no medicine being done in a visit, but spending time filling in documents. If you already realize the number of different types of consents that we have to sign, when you join a clinical trial, when you benefit of a compassionate use, when you have to enter a patient register, when you have a treatment initiation form part of risk management plan, when you receive a patient card, when you have an expensive medicine. You could easily spend your entire visit with your doctor only filling in documents, consents, and not doing medicine at all. And furthermore, patients tend to forget what they have signed, what it says. Even when you are in a clinical trial, after some months or years, you completely forgot it's a trial. So what's the real value of a written document that many patients fear it has some legal consequences of in case something wrong happens? What did I sign? What rights did I renounce to exactly? This consent form, I understand the idea, but in practice, again, we fear, well, some fear that the outcome would be not in line with the intention.
Mike, you'd like to contribute something?
Yes, I'd like to just make a few comments on the issue of transparency. And I think the MEP has left now, but I'm absolutely with Francois. I think it's very important that we continue to drive the patient centricity of the situation, and that does require the patient to offer consent. And whilst I agree with Francois to a certain extent, I know for a fact when I had a macular problem, I went to Moorfields in London, and yes, I did have to sign forms. But because the nurse and the doctor were so very articulate in explaining to me what was going to be done, etc., I had no problem. And as we all do, we place our trust in the healthcare professionals, and by and large, they have our absolute interest at heart. And so, generally speaking, it really works very well. But I think consent by the patient will drive the communication channels. And as Guy has said, providing that the guidelines are well worked out, then that will give rise to a better off-label prescribing situation. Registers in the digital world must be more and more easy to come by. In terms of conflict of interest, I find this an interesting one. Oh, hello, hi. You'll be interested in this. I spent 32 years in the pharmaceutical industry and we're very proud of it. I retired from that body 7 years ago now. The ESM is funded by the pharmaceutical industry and technical companies. We have a board situation that enables us to make independent decisions, and I actively pursue getting funding from the commercial area, because if they didn't fund organizations like the one I work for, I wouldn't be up here now championing patient safety. I find it a very easy fit. I put a patient safety hat on and I get involved in thinking about how to make the environment safer for the patient. And I think that's very important. And when I spend time visiting German lawyers, which I have done, who are looking at 5 patients who are potentially going to be blinded by a situation that has been caused by off-label usage, and I have no problem in off-label usage at all. I think it's absolutely necessary in so many medical situations. Often, and this is a slight digression, but it's an important digression, often within a pharmacy, when dosages have to be changed, formulations have to be modified, then that is not under GMP, good manufacturing practice. And therefore, I'm equally interested in where the damage is potentially done, and that is, if you like, potentially in the pharmacy when extemporization actually takes place. It's very interesting the WHO have Avastin on their essential medicines list. Like the Veterans Association in the US, they have said you will take 1 vial of Avastin, you will draw up 1 dose for the eye for macular degeneration, and you will throw the 4 vials away. Put yourself in Uganda, in a hospital in Uganda, with a vial of Avastin. Will you really throw it away after that single dose?
Okay, thank you. I'll now take a new round of questions from the floor. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Tjitske van der Zande. I'm from the Dutch Pediatric Formulary and also on behalf of the TEDdy Network. And I would like to stress the necessity of off-label prescribing in pediatrics, where off-label prescribing is often not a matter of free choice, but really a bare necessity. And some of the criteria pointed out by the good practice of off-label use, as said by Mr. Dooms, could really harm off-label practice use in pediatrics, as many conditions for which drugs are used off-label in pediatrics aren't really severe or aren't really life-threatening, and this would really restrict medicine use in children, in pediatrics, and also the criteria of having a good level of evidence. We could never fulfill that criteria. So I would like to ask the comment of Mr. Dooms on this aspect of label use.
Yes, you mean more unlicensed use, right? In pediatrics, we do a lot of crushing tablets and all that.
No, I also
but
many pediatric use are not described in the label in the SMPC.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's true.
It's not indicated for use in children. In many,
but in
many
pediatrics,
drugs.
you also have what he mentioned, unlicensed use, when we start compounding and crushing and all that.
Yes,
but
we do that a lot.
Yeah. That's another problem. You understand what I mean? That's more complicated than just straight off-label use.
Yes, but by setting the criteria that a condition should be at least severe or life-threatening to comply with good off-label use practices, we could never fulfill that in pediatrics because within the label for many, many drugs used in children, the indication or the age group of children is not being described in the product label.
Okay. Well, as mentioned, Mark, as mentioned in your presentation, let's take away. I mean, let's leave this room with this kind of comments and see how the declaration can become a lively document and maybe come with a 2.0 version. You had a comment.
Yeah, good morning. This is Lucia Ruggieri, also on behalf of TEDI Network. I want to stress what has been just mentioned regarding the pediatric aspects, asking to the presenters if you think that the principle that you have listed, very relevant for the off-label practice, can be mutuated to the pediatric setting, and what do you think could be added? What is your opinion about this? And the second one is just a curiosity regarding the survey that has been conducted regarding the off-label use to patients, if there were also parents of ill children. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Cristian Galasso. I'm a PhD student in the research field in Italian Institute. And from the discussion, it seems that the pharmaceutical company, for the pharmaceutical company, it's more expensive to transform an off-label compound in on-label compound for another application than a new lead compound. So it seems that the pipeline to arrive to a new drug on the market is too easy, starting from lead compound, from the basic research. I don't know if this is quite strange, because we know that starting from thousands of new natural products, new molecules, just one, so it's a really small percentage of the research arrive on the market. Instead of a compound is already on the market. So probably there is a gap in this pipeline, and probably Europe could also think to simplify the legal aspect of research funding to improve the study of new off-label compound for other applications. So Europe probably, with the funding, with the simplification, can push to avoid this difference between research on lead compound and off-label compound. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those of you who are pushed away from asking questions by the fact that we have reached 12 o'clock shouldn't be, because we can extend a little bit. So I'm really mindful that everyone having something to say today has a chance to take the floor. So I'll take a few more questions, and then the panel, each panelist will have 1 minute final remarks. Yes, please. Yeah? No? Okay. Sorry, I saw a finger over there, but okay, go ahead.
Good afternoon, my name is Jamie Wilkinson. I'm from the Pharmaceutical Group of the European Union. Our organisation represents the 400,000 community pharmacists from all over Europe. Thanks very much to all the presenters, very interesting points. And I'd just like to offer a very brief, practical, not a question, but sort of just a hint. When we're dealing with off-label prescribing in primary care, often we may have less life-threatening situations, similar to the comment from our pediatric colleague over there. If you think about metformin and its use in PCOS, often you may have very confused patient when they receive the packaging and they read the material. Obviously, you're expecting, when you read that, to be for diabetics. Something I think which could help mitigate this and improve the health literacy of our patients and the flow and the journey through the health system is to include the indication on the prescription, perhaps in the directions. And this would allow all healthcare professionals and patients involved to better understand what this medicine is being used for. So just a hint for maybe being put into guidelines at a national level.
Some EU member states already have that.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Otherwise, yes, please.
Good morning. Richard Price, European Association of Hospital Pharmacists. Very quick question. One of the messages that was coming out from the session was the need for better information about the prevalence, extent, and nature of off-label use across Europe. do any of the panelists have good practices from at a national level that could be shared or adopted at the European level, or other suggestions? And a brief comment to the European Commission. Should guidelines be developed at the European level, please make sure those are subject to open consultation, that stakeholders such as ourselves can input.
Thank you very much. So the two last questions. Yes, please.
Mi chiamo
Barbara Decono. I am working on a degree in bionutrition and dietary therapy. I see many patients who have rare pathologies, and they need a very disciplined approach, and not just from a pharmaceutical point of view. Professor Goodwin earlier talked about regulation of drugs by associations such as FMI and another European association, but you also said that prescriptions are often the responsibility of the doctors themselves. So non-marketing use, but the doctor is finally responsible for that. So this responsibility should be both on and off label. We often talk about children's pathologies, rare pathologies among children. Isn't there a risk that you fall into tests on humans? What about compassionate use? Could that not mask or hide the safety of the patient? Perhaps it could be used for compassionate use, but it may hide the commercial interests of the pharmaceutical companies. Thank you.
Very much. Last question.
Yes, I'm Sarah Roda from the Council of European Dentists. I have a question with regards to the clinical exception and the use of off-label. You have EU regulation that prohibits the use of certain products in children, and I can give you the example of tooth whitening products. Can this situation be used? So can you use here the clinical exception? In some countries you can, and it's even promoted the off-label use in these cases. So, and this because it's less intrusive than the alternative treatments. So I would be curious to know. I would think not, but I would be curious to know.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now giving the floor to each panelist by reverse order of presentation. So I'll start with you, André, if you'd like to provide your conclusion of the discussion and maybe address a few of the points that were just raised.
First, I think this discussion is showing, how complex issue we are trying to solve, and it didn't change my feelings that the journey is complex and complicated. But of course, I think we should not stop to look for the best optimal solution. So be my first conclusion. The second, answering to the question of how industry is interacting with this phenomena. Of course, industry is also having stimulus, to put indication on the product, because they will get extra data, extra protection of intellectual property rights. The other input from the regulator's point of view was the pediatrics regulation. Again, trying to give some initiatives to make more products available to children. And lastly, we also see that number of orphan designation were born from the out-of-label use, and they become the medicines of choice. So I think it's very important to also make sure that the pharmacovigilance is working better, because as we discussed already, we see more and more reports coming from patients, but also from healthcare professionals. But it's still, we need to do more and more to make sure that we get as much as we can, and then decision can be made the transparent way on the evidence base as well, because I also believe that the evidence base is a key conditions for this work.
Thank you very much. James?
Just come back to our debate that we've been having. It's just a sidebar amongst on the legal side. I mean, I think one big picture conclusion we shouldn't forget is we shouldn't allow off-label use for partially economic reasons to undermine the marketing authorization. which is supposed to be a gold standard based on extensive clinical trials. We shouldn't undermine the role of the EMA having national regulators saying, well, I know this isn't approved by the EMA, but this is cheaper, I'm going to approve it, I've got some evidence. We should avoid that and avoid fragmenting the European market. I think member states who need to save money should look more aggressively at the other means they already have and sometimes don't use, whether it be HTAs, price cuts, which are allowed to do under the Transparency Directive, hard negotiations, just being a bit tougher sometimes, or the kind of joint procurement exercises we've just seen brought in by some countries. There's lots of other ways to save money that I think you should try first before you think about off-label use for economic reasons.
Thank you. Mike?
Yes, I'd just like to conclude by thanking you all for coming and for your interest in this very important topic. It's very timely, so thank you for the EBC and Mr. Pedicini for putting this meeting on. I was really pleased that we are beginning to make progress, and I think this meeting has demonstrated that. And I'm really pleased that the Commission study is nearing finalisation. I think this may well turn out to be the fulcrum from which we can actually catalyse and accelerate the thinking process. And I was encouraged that this hopefully will come to some form of conclusion in terms of the report at the end of this year. And I do hope that Member States do believe greater coordination across Europe is needed in this area. That was posed as a question on one of the slides. I do hope the Member States actually say, yes, we do need greater coordination. And it was also mentioned perhaps that the EMA confines its activity to the authorised situation of medicines. And I think there is a great need for a body to take ownership of this issue, more ownership, and therefore I would encourage the EMA to actually take an even more active part, because we do need an authoritative body to, if you like, supplement existing guidelines, coordinate guidelines that have already been mentioned do exist and are very good in certain member states already. So I hope that this meeting here bodes very well for the near future as opposed to the far future, because we need something more quickly than that has been happening to date. Thank you.
Thank you very much. François?
First, response to your question, yes, we have data from children. We have parents who explain that it's for their children, roughly 2 to 4% of the sample. The freedom to prescribe a medicine off-label is certainly a source of medical progress. Not only it helps treating patients, but how many medical discoveries started with an off-label use. It's important to highlight the risk and safety issues, but it shouldn't be done separately from the benefit for society, for public health, and for the patients to have the possibility to use a medicine off-label. And whatever the guidelines and the procedures that probably will be discussed and decided to document on these uses, to collect data, safety and efficacy data, to justify these prescriptions further, we should be very careful not to impose an even more, I wouldn't say bureaucratic, but workload on the healthcare professionals to use medicine off-label, to prescribe them off-label, because then we will have a risk and we may impact negatively public health. And another aspect which I think is anyway of utmost importance, there is a huge gap between the information patients have when using a medicine on label. There are summaries of the European Public Assessment reports that explain why the medicine has been approved, which clinical trials were conducted and what were their results. And this doesn't exist for the large number of patients who use a medicine off-label. So what can be done with the current legislation to start filling in this gap, to start providing the information to patients when they need it, when they look for it? I think that's also an aspect that we should discuss more in line with the adoption of the declaration in terms of providing of information, what can be improved.
I mean, as we've heard, the key issue here is evidence and the relative dearth of evidence for off-label prescribing. I think the solutions to that would be obviously independent randomized controlled trials, and just a note that the Clinical Trials Directive set back research tremendously in Europe. And one thing that you as legislators might do is to reform that to make independent clinical trials easier and reduce the barriers to getting new evidence. So that's something you should not add to your legislative boat, but reduce from your legislation. The second is that if you're going rare diseases, it's impossible to do those kinds of trials. But the very interesting possibility now is through social media and the internet, patient organizations can bring together patients from all over the world with rare but nevertheless individual experience. And that, if you want to collect data for rare diseases, seems to be the way forward, and I think is particularly interesting as we move to a better understanding of the genetic mechanisms underlying rare and complex diseases. For common diseases, the issue is also not just clinical trials, which are possible, but also improved registers, and we should invest in countries that allow the collection of data and the linkage between health data and, for example, pharmacy data and other social outcomes like offending, which are and economic outcomes in general, which are key to understanding the value of treatment. So the answer to much of this is better research and funding for that research, which I hope will come from the European level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mark?
I'm so happy, Frederick, that after 40 years of grey zone, finally I can see some light at the end of the tunnel. If I may finish with an advice, please do not make it very complicated. When we start mixing unlicensed use, falsified medication, compounding, import, misdiagnosis and all that, it will be too complicated. Take it simple from the start, try to make good guidelines and then eventually extend them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now handing over my role as moderator of the day to you, Mr. Pedicini. I would like to reiterate our thanks for that event today. I would like to thank you all also for coming and contributing to that debate. It was a really lively discussion. As I said in the beginning, that was the intention. And it is our intention to continue this kind of events, to try and hear from multiple stakeholders their point of view. You are invited to prolong the discussion after the end of the event. And before handing over to you, Mr. Pedicini, I would like to thank again the panelists, the team behind the setting up of the event, as well as our interpreters. Thank you.
Bene.
Okay. I'd also like to thank you all. I think that this was a very rich event. Lots of interesting points have come up, and I think they're going to be very useful to us in the European Parliament. I'd also like to give special thanks to Margarita Oken. Often we do share political views as well. And so I hope that you can feed back the information that's come out today. And in our committee, perhaps we can speak to the bigger political groups to make sure that there is some follow-up about the need for regulation in this sector. So we've learnt a lot today. We've learnt that off-label use is not always well known by patients, but even by doctors. And one of the main problems is the extrapolation of the results of studies. We have to extend those studies to minors as well. There's another risk of side effects, often because there is a lack of necessary studies, both phase 1 and phase 2 studies. And there is a problem of defensive medicine. And there are difficulties linked to the differing legislative systems in different countries around the EU. That can lead to legal loopholes that lead to a different availability of medicines. And that at times even leads to a need for off-label use. We talked about guidelines. Guidelines can be useful in a transitional phase, but we hope to reach binding legislation and regulation. However, guidelines can be useful in a transitional period. We will also look carefully at the report that's been prepared by DG Sanko at the Commission. We'll look at all the elements of that. I think that's a starting point for a broader dialogue leading to definitive legislation. And of course, we understand that limits have to be placed. There are dangers. There's dangers to online sales or sales not relating to a prescription. There's the risk of side effects, as I've mentioned. But we should also consider the opportunities, particularly when there are situations in which people cannot access drugs, such as is the case for rare diseases or for age groups, where in many cases there are no alternatives. There are some member states that have economic difficulties, and as such, they may not always be able to access drugs in the same way as on-label drugs can be accessed. We have all sorts of problems caused by economic crises. We have diseases which are spreading rapidly at the doors of the European Union. So we have to be reactive. And we have to look at research as well, and the direction that research is taking, and the effects that the economic crisis have had on research. The pharmaceutical industry produces research, and 90% of the funding for that goes into 10% of pathologies. And those pathologies, those 10%, concern developed societies with more money. My group, not just me, but my group, is often accused very superficially as being a Eurosceptic group. We have realized since coming here that actually we are very in favor of a united Europe. Of course, we are critical of certain dysfunctions of the Union as it stands, but I have a small dream which is involving people like you here today. There's a lot of students here today, people doing research into medicine. We would have a public European pharmaceutical company. Now, if all member states could put their own knowledge to good use, and young people, and try to write a situation in which 90% of investment would go towards 90% of pathologies, then perhaps we wouldn't have these situations which generate off-label use. That could be a potential response to the current system and the current imbalance. So I look forward to the contribution of those political groups which have common sense. So thank you very much for coming, and have a good afternoon.